Hello, this is Property Matters, a weekly catch-up on all matters property, supported by Fairview International Property Consultancy and auctionproperty.co.uk. And we're live every Sunday from 10 a.m. on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and our website, propertymatterstv.co.uk. On the website, leave us a Google review if you would, and if you're on social media, please get involved in the conversation below. Our email address for our questions programs, such as this one today, is hello@propertymatterstv.co.uk. So if you've got a property-related question, get in touch and let us know, and we'll feature it in a future show. If you don't have time to watch the show in total, then you can watch us on the move or listen to us on the move with our podcast, of course, every Monday following the Sunday show at 10 a.m. Just search Property Matters TV wherever you get your podcasts from. Finally, the show is broadcast across the week on Dilsey Radio as well, so we welcome listeners there. And we say Merry Christmas to Joe Joshi. Just less than 24 hours to go now because it's Christmas Eve.
Yes, thank you very much to all of our viewers and listeners throughout 23, and also to our contributors, Guy Charrison, Bob Singh, and Merry Christmas to you all. And of course, we'll look forward to seeing you in 2024 for your contributions and additions. And of course, we always welcome some new other hosts which will be joining us in 24, Paul, on the basis that we've got surveyors and architects and so forth coming up, which I've been talking to have them join us so that we can try and give a wider view, not just my little input and wisdom, but perhaps get some other professionals on board as well. So looking forward to having them on in 24 to add to us. But before we progress to this program, just a quick thank you to all of you who help us put this together and encourage us to do that, and all your questions that come in, and all the tests that Paul puts me to every week without fail.
Which we're going to do, because just because it's Christmas Eve doesn't mean we're not going to put you on the rack again. So here we go with more questions for you today, Joe. We own our own home in Plymouth outright. We have no mortgage on it. Next March, we plan to move to Manchester for work. We only have just bought our Plymouth home in May 2022. Our plan is to rent in Manchester for at least 2 years. At the moment, we've no plans to return or settle in Plymouth in the future. We bought the house because at the time of buying, we thought we could be here for 5 years, but then our work circumstances changed. Do you think it would be wise to rent out our home in Plymouth or take out a mortgage on it to fund our costs in Manchester and at the same time let it out? Our concern is that if we purely rent it out without taking out a mortgage, the monthly income after tax is not enough to cover the costs in Manchester fully. We will have to cover it out of our monthly income. I wonder what would be the best cost-saving way to approach this. What are your thoughts, Joe? Tricky one.
Yes, has lots of connotations in this question, really, and it's all about personal circumstances. I mean, first of all, of course, to buy something outright was excellent. They obviously have the money to buy something in the first place. Obviously, didn't bargain for this change of circumstances that have happened now, so it's the case of deciding to see what is right. Of course, the temptation is always there to keep what you've got. And hopefully that it rents out, and then that helps towards your rental property in Manchester. But it may be probably prudent, maybe not time-wise, but perhaps if you can rent it for a couple of years and then perhaps move, that gives you two avenues. One is that it gives you a chance to get to know Manchester whilst you're renting, so you are not just rushing into buying something immediately. And it also gives you time to make sure that you get the better value for the property that you bought in the first place, because what you don't want to do is lose money on it. So it might be that the market will change and you'd get a better price, and therefore more money to be able to spend on the property that you like, and have liked the area around Manchester or wherever your new work and new life is going to be. So it is a combination. So it's a balancing act. But obviously, if the ideal situation happened, you'd probably sell one and buy one, and then you'd have a bigger deposit, and you wouldn't have to worry about it not being rented, void periods, and not coming in, no income coming in, and so forth. So it really is a personal circumstance question. as to what your personal circumstances allow you to do. But from my point of view, I would probably advise at the moment that rent it for a couple of years and rent one for a couple of years. So you have the best of both. One, better price for yours long term, and secondly, a better area perhaps than where you rent, because you might find that once you live in Manchester and where you rent it is not where you end up buying. You might buy in another area, which may be a bit more expensive or perhaps even cheaper.
Of course, the other thing to consider with this is that if you're living in Manchester and you've got a rental home in Plymouth, it's not necessarily always going to be easy to sort out any problems with your rental, because you've got a hell of a journey from Manchester to Plymouth, haven't you? And if you have a letting agent look after it for you, you're going to get even less return and therefore not going to cover your mortgage in Manchester.
Yes, and of course the distance is a real killer in property, because you could end up spending half that time just in travel and to achieve almost nothing to a large extent. So you are going to be reliant on an agent or a letting agent in that area that's going to help you achieve that goal. But what I'm saying is that it may be a pain worth taking for a couple of years in order to make sure that you make the right educated decision, as opposed to a rush decision to saying, well, actually, I'll sell it now, maybe not get as much for it as you did because the market is in the current condition. And then maybe if you decided to buy somewhere straight away, Manchester, it may not be the area that you want to be in. So I think if you can rent it, but certainly, obviously, it's not going to be a cheap move. And also, all the other related costs, sale cost and then purchase costs. So you've got to pay, take all of that into consideration. And I think I would stand by my thoughts are that balance it over a couple of years and then make a decision.
And possibly just sell up in Plymouth and then look to buy when you've got the time and the money to do so in Manchester.
Yeah, absolutely, and also the right place in Manchester. That's the key thing. Because if you rush them, then you might find that you've actually bought something that you don't, or in an area where you don't really want to be in. It doesn't work. So you have the window of opportunity here to make sure that you do the right thing. The good thing is you own the property, so it's not a burden. The fact is that if you are getting that perhaps slightly lesser on rent, it just means that you've got to find that in Manchester. But at the same time, if you've only recently bought the property and now decide to sell it in the current climate, you may not achieve what you bought it for. And so therefore, the decision will be wiser to just wait a bit longer.
Let's move on to our second question. I'm selling my parents' home in the Netherlands after my brother and I inherited it. We have to pay inheritance tax in the Netherlands, but if I bring the remaining funds across to the UK as a deposit for my first property, do I have to pay tax again? We will hopefully be getting more than 250,000 for the property, but realistically, probably less than 350. I wanted to keep some for a small place in the Netherlands and get a mortgage there, but Dutch banks won't deal with anyone earning in sterling for now, until the bilateral arrangements have been ironed out. If I keep it in a savings account in the Netherlands, I will continue to pay tax each year. So what's our suggestions there, Joe? Interesting one.
It's very interesting. Not one I've come across, but I'm just going to be lateral in my thought on this. That it is going to be that you've got to think about. First of all, we're not tax advisors, so you do need to take guidance from someone who is qualified to give you tax advice. But from the face of it, the chances are that if you've paid something for your taxes in the Netherlands, you are not likely to have to perhaps consider paying any, if or maybe just a small amount in the UK, depending on what it is. You're certainly not going to get away from things like stamp duty, etc. Now that might be another area that you've got to think about, because if you are looking to buy something back in Netherlands with the balance of your money or not, then it might be that you have to sort of decide which one is the first to do. So if you sold your parents' house, got your money, brought it over, you need to just take advice, taxation advice, as to what is the correct way to perhaps progress your next move in order to make sure that you make the best savings logistically from tax point.
Since 1980, the UK has had a double taxation agreement with the Netherlands, which prevents you having to pay inheritance tax twice. So they won't need to pay inheritance tax on the on arriving back in the UK. But also the other thing, of course, is if they buy their UK property first, then they would face a higher rate of stamp duty in the UK, which is the standard rate of 3%. So SDLT is charged in England and Northern Ireland rather. Different land taxes with different thresholds and rates apply in Scotland and Wales, of course. A higher rate of tax is charged in the UK if you're buying a second property, irrespective of where your first property is located. So basically, if they buy the Netherlands one first, they'll pay more stamp duty on the UK home because they will be buying a second home, essentially.
Yes, that's the one I was trying to allude to, that basically they need to take the advice of what is the first correct step for them. If they are going to buy something back in the Netherlands, then they need to perhaps make that purchase before, so after buying something in the UK, because as you rightly say, they will be liable for a higher stamp duty as a buy-to-let stamp duty as opposed to an ownership. The other thing that they may consider doing, of course, is purchasing the assets, certainly the one in Netherlands, in a limited company or a company in a corporate environment, which takes them away from a personal circumstance. And that also could happen in the UK. They could buy a property in a company based as a limited company, and that may not have the effect. But like I said at the outset, we're not tax advisors, and we can certainly guide you and direct you if the question was raised again. For those that, as we have tax advisors available, we can refer you to, but it's not something that we do. But it's a good question. Thank you very much for bringing it in.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And with all of these things, getting a little bit of advice, a few £100s of advice can save you tens of thousands when you find out, 6 years down the line when there's an investigation that you've got all of this, and of course all the interest that will have accrued without you being aware of it. That's certainly what can happen to certain people.
Yeah. No, I think legal advice, tax advice is paramount.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next one then. I'm in the process of buying a property, and while making an offer via the seller's estate agents, I specifically mentioned in the email that I need a range cooker and that it was part of my offer. After a day or two, my offer was accepted by the seller. Now, while doing the conveyance process and looking at the fixtures and fittings form that the seller has filled in, it says that the range cooker is not included. When I checked with him again via my solicitor, the seller said that he had no idea that the range cooker was part of my offer and he won't leave it. I feel cheated because of this miscommunication from the property agent to the seller, and I've already spent a good amount of money on surveys and solicitors' charges. What are my rights here, and how should I approach this? Interesting question. I can't believe it's the first time it's happened.
I'm sure it happens a lot. I mean, the thing is that, first of all, if the details of the agent's particulars states that the range cooker is part of that, and a good agent would have had those particulars signed off by the seller in the first place, then of course the onus falls back on the seller to confirm that they did agree in the sales particulars that is what the representation was. And so if they've chosen to change that mind, but the chances in this case is that the agent has probably marketed this, probably not had the consent from the seller, because obviously agents were eager to get on the market and get it sold. And there is a slip up of a situation where the seller will say, well, actually, I never signed it and authorized it. The agent has probably advertised it, and therefore will be under misdescription. And so the buyer potentially could either, if they have got it signed off with the agent, with the seller, then go back to the seller and say, look, this particulars were signed by you, confirmed by you, and here's your signature and date saying that everything that we've written about your property is deemed to be correct. So therefore, we have to sell this range in the sale price of the agreed figure. If that isn't the case and they haven't got it signed off, then the problem is that it will probably fall on the agent who has chosen to go to the market without getting the consent from the seller, and so therefore may be liable, or the buyer could take the agent to task and make sure that they pay for a range cooker, which I'm sure they won't be too delighted, considering the fee that they'll earn is probably going to now end up paying for a range cooker out of it. So those are probably the two avenues that I can see immediate that may or may not be available. One is an exit and out for the agent. If they did their job correct, then the seller will have no choice but to include that range, because they accepted that in the details. But I'm probably thinking the agent didn't do that, and if he didn't do that, then the agent's probably going to be liable.
It's quite surprising that there's no legal rules over what can be left in the property and what should be removed. Apparently, there's nothing that binds them. The only thing, of course, in the conveyancing process is that it processes that TA10 form, where you actually specify, and that's the first time that actually, you put on record, officially in writing, what you're going to leave and what you're not. But I suppose the interesting thing is also, if you look at how much it costs to get rid of an AGA from a property, the minimum that you can find apparently is £600. So the fee that the seller's going to have to pay to remove that is £600. So maybe when they find out how expensive it is to move an AGA or a range cooker, then they might want to leave it there after all. But I suppose the thing you could do, of course, is to go back and say, well, look, I made my offer on the basis of a range cooker, and it's going to cost me £10,000 or thereabouts to buy a new one. So I'm going to make my offer £10,000 less for the property.
Well, that's exactly what will happen, and the negotiations will have taken place, and the best outcome would have come out of that, and that chances are that the seller will probably have to concede, because as you rightly say, the cost of removing it, and then whether it's going to go to wherever they're going to move to, or somebody's going to buy it. And a second-hand range is probably not going to be worth £10,000. It's probably worth a couple of £1,000, if that. So the question really is going to be, what is the right thing? But it's an interesting question to bring to us, on the basis that it just goes to show that little things can make all the difference. And when, in the early days of estate agents, when I was in there, we were always struggling to get this misdescription, and the onus on the property details were always not signed off. But we constantly used to argue about carpets, curtains, fixtures and fittings, bathroom fittings, light fittings. I clearly recall a particular property that I sold, and at the end of the day, all said and done, we argued about a chandelier in the staircase, which really probably wasn't worth the money that the seller wanted, and it was probably worth even less, because the buyer would have he just didn't want a hole in the ceiling, but he thought, well, I'll just keep that. It was negotiated. And eventually the seller had to concede and say, we'll keep it, because the buyer turned around and said, well, if I don't have that chandelier, either you replace it, make good, or I'm going to be out. I'm not going to buy it. So the cost of the chandelier and the replacement was probably much higher than just leaving it. So ultimately he had to leave it. So it is about just negotiating your position the best you can.
Also goes to prove that the conveyancing process is just so antiquated, isn't it? I mean, surely it wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibility to have all of this data available on Rightmove or Zoopla as downloadable PDFs of what's going to be in there, right from the outset. So there's no argument.
The problem with that is, and I agree, under auction terms and conditions, we always have the legal pack with all that information up front, so we know what we're selling. And I think that should be the policy that should be adapted for ordinary private treaty sales. But I think the reason why they don't do that is the change of mind. I might go to a house, that's what the customer says. I might move to a house that needs, an AGA or a range cooker. And so I'll take the one I've got because I know it, On the other hand, I might go to a house, it doesn't, so I'll change my mind. So that's why they don't do it. But the conveyancing system is so archaic that it's all after the event. So you think as an agent, you've done a deal, it's closed shop and it's ready to go. And then all of a sudden you find that actually you've still got some work to do. and that means that basically the sale may not actually happen.
Let's move on to our penultimate question. My wife and I have a buy-to-let property. We would like to add onto this mortgage our children. They are 26 and 31 years of age. Is it possible? If not, how can we transfer this property into their names without heavy fees, or rather, what would be the best way to transfer this property into their names? This used to be our home, and it's where both our children grew up, so the house is of sentimental value to them. Interesting.
Two things probably come to mind there. First of all, by adding the children to the property, they are going to reduce their chance of them buying their first time home separately on their own, and their circumstances might be that they want to go elsewhere. And so again, the problem with taxing may come into it, because the home that they may buy next on their own may not be the first time home, because they're already a part of a first home, and therefore they will end up paying higher stamp duty, higher taxation, and higher rates in borrowing. The second part, of course, is from an inheritance point of view. If anything was to happen to the parents and they were added at an early stage, then there's likelihood that they could make some savings on the inheritance tax, so there's no capital gains or CGT or whatever other tax that may apply. But in this situation, I would probably advise that it's probably better to keep the kids away, let them get on with their thing. At least they can buy on a first-time buyer basis of their own property wherever they're going to be, and maybe put the property into a trust of some sort, so that they get the benefit when the parents move on or pass away. And I think, again, I would say that it's an advice that you need to take advice from someone who deals with trusts, and of course financial advice and taxation advice.
Yeah, of course. Leave it in the will would be the best way, I think, and especially if you make a gift of it and leave it. If you survive the 7 years that it requires, then that might be a way around it. There is another issue, of course, is that the mortgage lender might not wish to or want to have the children added. They might find a problem with that.
Well, again, each person is down to having their own personal circumstances checked. It's always subject to status, as they say. And if their status doesn't allow them to be part of that, then that will jeopardize any chance of them doing something separate, let alone be part of the existing mortgage. On the other hand, the lender might find that if there's a small mortgage, they probably won't care. But if it's a 95% mortgage, then they've got to account for the reasons why they might actually have to add other people. But I think that you can explore those, but I would certainly let the children go and buy their own home first, and maybe once they've bought their own home as a first-time buyer, got their full benefits, they could then be back in and revisited and be added to the existing mortgage or to a trust that they can create.
And of course, if for any reason the parents can't pay the mortgage, then they're going to be liable for the full debt, aren't they, as well, which I'm sure they wouldn't be happy about.
Yes, naturally. If there's four people on it, they're all liable for it. It's a fair and square, equal contribution as far as the mortgage lender is concerned. And if two people can't afford it, then the other two got to find the money to afford it. But what I'm saying is that for the first-time buyers or the children, for them to actually turn around and say, well, I'm going to lose my opportunity to buy my own home in this case, I would certainly encourage that they do that first before considering anything as part of the existing parent family home.
Here's our final question for you on this Christmas Eve. I have a tenant in common mortgage with my ex-husband on our former marital home that he's been living in. He is now in a position to buy me out of the property and will either continue to pay the small mortgage or pay it off in full. We have agreed the price and have started the process of contacting the mortgage lender and so on. But I was wondering whether this sale would have any tax implications for me.
You've got the tax thing on these questions for me today, Paul, I can tell. And the answer again is going to be probably tax advice is important, but I think my answer on that from my general knowledge is that it was your a home, both of you, husband and wife, and really there should be no tax liability at all, other than your personal income tax. There should be no tax liability on the property because that's your own home or matrimonial home. You have already paid your taxes and there is no due for whatever gains. The fact that your circumstances changed and you created this tendency to be able to make sure that he can still stay there and cover it, but you still both jointly own the property, there should be no capital gains or any other tax. But again, I would put the caveat on by saying we'll need to advise you that you take tax advice for that.
Yes, because there is PRR, isn't there? Private residence relief or primary residence relief, which allows you to have a marital home and it not be subject to CGT when you sell. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that if you've got a home that is yours from day one, then it shouldn't have any CGT on it because it has been your own home. But the fact that, you know, one is living and the other one is moved out, there may be some area, some grey area. But in my opinion, I don't think there should be.
Interesting. Yeah, as always, worth checking that one out with the relevant experts in that field, an accountant or someone of that nature, or solicitor would probably be able to help with that, I guess. Well, Joe, that's very helpful, and we've certainly put you through the mill there, haven't we, with some challenging questions.
Yeah, thanks for that on Christmas Eve as well.
Yeah, no, I think we better let you go for a little bit of eggnog, shall we? And
I think so. Yeah.
and we wish everybody a Merry Christmas, of course, and we will be back for a New Year's Eve show on the 31st December, Sunday at 10 a.m. as always. Best wishes and season's greetings from Property Matters.